Once you've got a first draft of your newspaper or yearbook story, it's time to make sure that you're using a style that is appropriate for journalism. That's where P17 style and P18 revision come into play. So our two targets here start at the one level with being too wordy or too brief for journalistic style, and then the basic ability to edit for conventions, making sure that you have proper spelling and proper punctuation. At the 2 level, for style, you can write using appropriate style for journalism, and we'll talk about what that is, but you're inconsistent. So maybe sometimes you've got the style down, sometimes you get too wordy or too brief. At the 2 level, for our revising, you can edit for conventions and commonalities, meaning that you can revise to make sure that you're using an appropriate style. At the 3 level, for style, you can write using appropriate style for journalism, just point blank all the time. And at the 4 level, it is engaging as well, and we'll talk about what that means. And then for revising, you can revise content for content quality and edit for conventions. So you're taking time to make sure that what you have written is appropriately done and interesting. At the 4 level, you can revise for content and theme, and this is in relation particularly to yearbook, and you can edit for conventions and commonalities. Journalistic writing requires different skills than what you might find in writing your basic essay or your basic narrative. It generally is going to be more concise. It's going to have a more varied vocabulary, especially in things like dialogue tags. It should use active voice. You should follow conventions that are established by whatever publications agency you're working with, and you definitely have to have proper quote punctuation. And we're going to spend some more time talking about each of these 5 areas of style and convention. So concise sentences and paragraphs first. What does this mean? Your journalistic writing for both newspaper and yearbook should include shorter sentences, and those sentences should have strong nouns and verbs that are doing the work to create description. Okay? This isn't the place to get super wordy. Yes, I want you to be descriptive, but you can do that without writing a novel. People don't want to read a novel when they're just browsing through the newspaper. Your paragraph should only feature new information, no need to repeat things, even if you have 2 good quotes about the same subject. Only use one of them, you're going to have to make a choice. Here's an example of a concise statement. Joe Schmo, junior quarterback, scored 2 of the 4 touchdowns. I've got my who and I've got what happened, and nothing extra to help add in information. I can use more detail about the actual event to build an image of this, but I'm not going to get fancy here. What's not concise? Longer sentences that have lots of adjectives and adverbs to help build the description. You don't need that if you have appropriate nouns and verbs. Paragraphs that feature repeated information, especially if you have quotes on the same topic, that can become very not concise very quickly. Here's an example of that same sentence we just saw. Our amazing junior quarterback, Joe Schmo, scored 2 of the 4 touchdowns with his lightning speed. We've got our amazing to add to junior quarterback with his lightning speed. Yeah, it's nice to know that he's fast, but I could have used other things like statistics to help show that without adding in all these extra adjectives. Okay. You'll also want to use a varied vocabulary. Now, what that means is that you want to make sure that whatever you happen to be writing about, you use the vocab that's related to it. For example, if you're writing about football, I would expect to see football terms used, like quarterback and touchdown and defense. If you're writing about a math class, I might expect to see things like lesson and textbooks and geometry used rather than just general math. Be specific. You'll also want to use a variety of appropriate dialogue tags. These are the words that you use to introduce or to end your quotes. For general statements, you could use things like said. There's nothing wrong with using said here. Explained, described, remembered, all good options. For loud statements, and I mean really, like they were loud when you heard them, perhaps the crowd was screaming or the cheerleaders were yelling, you could use things like yell and cheer and bellowed and exclaimed. But you're only going to want to do that when it truly was loud. Okay? This isn't just like someone was like trying to talk over the noise of the cafeteria kind of loud. Avoid replied. If you're using replied as a dialogue tag, I can only assume that you're also including an I asked somewhere in your story, and you don't need to do that. You can cut out those I asked, and that means you are also cutting out the replied. Let the other dialogue tags stand in here, especially the ones under general statements. You'll want to use active voice for your writing. Now, active voice is actually not as scary as it might sound. I'm not talking about presentation here either. I'm talking about your writing still. Active voice talks about the verbs that you use, and active voice involves using single, strong verbs. We can compare this to passive voice, which requires using helping verbs, like to be and to have. Active voice will result in more concise sentences that will allow you to get to the point. Example. and we saw this one earlier. Joe Schmo, junior quarterback, scored 2 of the 4 touchdowns. I've got my noun, and I've got what he did. He scored. A single verb. If I'm going to write this in passive voice and take up more space, which is not what we want to do, I could say Joe Schmo, junior quarterback, had scored 2 of the 4 touchdowns. I've had to add in some language here. 2 of the 4 touchdowns were scored by junior quarterback Joe Schmo. Okay? No reason to write in passive voice. Just be to the point. Give your noun, give your verb, and move on. Now, conventions come into play when we talk specifically about editing. Conventions are agreed upon commonalities in how our staff writes certain items, and these differ from publication to publication. For us, for both newspaper and yearbook, in previous years, we've agreed on these 4 laws of publications land, and you'll see these posted at the back of our lab. They'll be there all year, and if you ever break any of these laws, I'm just going to say Law 1, and it'll be up to you to figure out what I'm talking about. Law 1 is who versus that. People who, things that. Okay, there it is right there. So, for example, Joe, who worked all summer, made $2,000. You would not say Joe that worked all summer made $2,000. People are whose, we're not things. Things only that. Our second law is that we use labels for how we write labels for students' grades. When we are writing out students' names, you must always include their grade, and you need to write it out. Otherwise, it implies that we're talking about their age, and we do not have a bunch of 9 to 12-year-olds in the high school. When you write it out, it's going to look like this. It could be student, comma, grade, and you'll write it out, freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior, comma, and then whatever else you have to say about them. Or you can start with the grade, freshman, and then the student name, and then blah, blah, blah. Now notice in the second example, you do not need commas, okay? We're using it as an adjective here, so you don't need to worry about commas. Only use commas to mark off the grade if you're using the grade after the student's name. Here's an example. Joe Schmo, comma, junior, earned the highest SAT score, or, also correct, junior Joe Schmo earned the highest SAT score. Law 3, JV and varsity. We always write out junior varsity and varsity. This is just so that we can be consistent, because what happens otherwise is we tend to write out varsity and then we tend to abbreviate JV, and that creates some differences in style. So you're going to write them both out and be sure to use lowercase j and v and a lowercase v. You do not need to capitalize junior varsity and varsity. It is not a proper noun. Our final law is related to student names. In the newspaper and in the yearbook, you need to use full names on first reference, and then you can use nicknames after that, and that's only per page. So you wouldn't be like, oh, well, so-and-so was mentioned on page 1, so I can use their nickname now. Nope, it goes by per page. Here's an example of how that might look. Let's say that a student's full name was Henry Joe Schmo, but he goes by Joe, okay? We've had examples or cases of that in the past, right? So in my first reference, I would say, Henry Joe Schmo, comma, junior, comma, earned the highest SAT score, and then I can use his nickname. Joe explained, I practice on Khan Academy for 15 minutes every day starting in January to help get a good score, okay? It can work just like that. And even if you mention a student in a story at the top of the yearbook spread and then he's later referenced in a caption, you can use their nickname in the caption. That's totally fine, so long as they've been referenced in a place that is likely to be read first. Those are our 4 laws that we follow. If anything gets added in, we'll be sure to let you know. Okay, our final convention that we're going to look at is quote punctuation. You're going to be writing with quotes frequently for this course, and so it's important that you punctuate them properly. You will want to always include a comma before the quote if the quote does not start the sentence, and a comma or a period before the final quotation mark. Other rules, a new speaker means a new paragraph. Anytime you have a quote from a new person, you have to start a new paragraph even if the topic is the same. We saw this particular set of paragraphs in the story structure, but I want to highlight it here for its punctuation. In typical to the point fashion, Coach Joe said, comma, because I'm introducing my quote, and then quote mark, it was a good season. We learned a lot and won some big games. Period, and then the quote mark. His players, though, reveal how Coach Joe helped them learn and win. This quote, this season was so different from the past. And notice I don't need anything before this because the quote starts the paragraph. Coach Joe expected us to treat every practice like a game, go hard every day. That intensity helped us improve and win against teams like Fowler and PW. Comma, and then the quote mark, said Junior Joe Smith. And then I close with the traditional period. Okay? You've got to use punctuation on both ends of a quote, and the closing punctuation always goes inside the quotation mark. Those are the common conventions that we will work with this year and common tips that you should be using in your writing for journalism.